Herbert, you are the new president of Africa Rugby. Briefly talk to me about your vision.
Well, I think the vision for me is really quite clear. I have a history within sports administration the last 20 years of recognizing one fundamental thing, and that is that sport is big business. I think that it might seem like a blasé thing to say, but I think that the problem that we have, mainly in Africa, but around the world, because it's not only restricted to Africa, is that sports administrators see it purely as a job. And I think when it is that you have good sports administrators, they understand that the issue of raising money in a ever-changing, dynamic world is critical. Sports is not like it was in the old days. And Africa is a little bit behind in understanding that a supreme athlete these days trains and lives for the sport. Nutrition, training, Medicare, the psychological approach, and then competing regularly, as well as managing themselves through that to be able to peak at relevant times, is what makes great sports personalities. In Africa, we still have situations whereby there is not enough funding, and therefore it is that people put on a shirt, a set of boots, and then they go and play. It is simply not good enough. Africa, as we know it, have the world champions in this great sport of rugby. Don't forget that second to soccer, rugby is just about the biggest global sport. It might be difficult for some people in America to recognize that, but outside of globally, you'll find that it is played on all four corners. So the fundamentals are understanding that sport is big business, and therefore we have to change the dynamic, our relationship with our global body, our relationship with others, and look at means of raising that whilst trying to make sure that it becomes the alternative sport to soccer across the continent of Africa.
So let me ask you, you're talking about sports being a business. That means you have to change mindset, or you have to help people to realize and come around to your vision. How do you plan on doing that?
Well, you're absolutely correct. That is the word that I have used before I came to office and since, and that is a change of mindset. That is a major issue here, because we have to look at it two ways. I'm calling for a change of mindset internally first. Internally. I'm not one of those who says the world owes us. Nobody owes anybody in this dispensation. So we need to change internally the mindset. It means within Rugby Africa, there's a big shakeup. Are the right people in the right place? Do we need different people in? We need to get people who really appreciate that bottom line. If it is that our global body give the whole of Rugby Africa, and that is all 30-something states in Africa, $2.5 million a year. You know that cannot even run one federation, and that's what we're coping with for 30-something federations. It means that we need to change our mindset internally to say that we need to go out there and look for money. We need to look and understand that the dynamics of doing business in Africa is different from the rest of the world. Because if you're in America, you can get one broadcaster and therefore go for TV rights across the whole country. If you're in Europe, you can do the same, whether it's Sky, Canal Horizon, or something of the sort, Star TV in the Far East. But in Africa, with its colonial links, French operate differently from Anglophone, West operate differently from East, Arabs in the North operate differently from the South, so you can't take the great game and go and get TV rights and raise money through the traditional channels. You have to be completely different in your mindset. So we're looking for internal changes to recognize that. Recognize that the world is moving on. After all, with rugby, they're now coming to invest in North America. And we shouldn't forget that North American rugby itself, their finances have not been great over the last few years. Whereas in Africa, we've always kept our books 100% as they should be. And yet it is they've moved on. And yet it is that we're still expected to manage our affairs. So the relationships we then have, once you have the right people in place, which is what we're trying to do now, with World Rugby, with the RFU, with FFR, when I say RFU, that's the English Rugby Football Union, which we're about to start. FFR, which is the French Rugby Federation, with the AU itself, African Union, to look to put rugby on the curriculum for schools in some format or other, and the others in terms of their funding programs directly through their existing sponsors or through the development agencies who are actually spending money in Africa for training and such like. We need to be in a position where we understand that funding will now have to come from alternative sources.
Now, Herbert, how do you intend engaging respective governments in Africa to actualize this dream? Because as you know, in Africa, governments play key roles in how administrations are run, or even, any business or entity, sports-wise, are run in their countries across Africa.
You're absolutely correct, and I think this is something that I've come in and I had to bring in my past experience from running Kumasi Asante Kotoko to the world of rugby to understand that we need, if you're not politically linked, then you are compromised. And I think that the leadership of rugby generally across Africa is not politically linked. And therefore the challenges are there. It is not like, as I said, if it is Patrice Motsepe, who are wealthy in their own right, the owners of TP Mazembe and all the other massive clubs across Africa. They are either massive business entities unto themselves, or they have the political wherewithal to move forward. I've been in office now for 4 to 5 months. And what I've done in this time period is engage presidents and ministers in sports so far in 7 countries. And I'm on a mission to get through all of those who are ready to do business. We now have some. I sat recently with the Honorable Minister and Cabinet Secretary in Kenya, and I have so much respect for them. And I said, we need to move forward in a different way. If it is that Africa is going to compete, then the major nations need to increase the number of international matches they play. We can't be in Africa with no budget, and then it is a great nation like Kenya plays only 1 test match a year or 2 test matches a year, when its competitors in Europe, for example, are playing 8, 10, 12, 14 test matches a year. It makes no sense. And whilst we grapple with what we do with World Rugby, we do need the involvement of government to be able to pay hosting rights and to support the development of rugby in their countries to move forward, to build rugby pitches. I mean, you'll be surprised that across Africa there are not many nations with dedicated rugby pitches. And not everybody... I
was about to ask you about infrastructure.
Yes.
How are you going to go about it?
Absolutely. It's just down the same line. So what we have, for example, in Ghana, we've been lucky enough that His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo has started the construct of a dedicated rugby pitch at Legon. I've been to inspect it with my representatives from Africa and World Rugby. It is up to standard. So we have that in Ghana. In Kenya, the government has also leased off land specifically for that purpose. And throughout Africa, that process has started. In Zimbabwe, they have. In La Côte d'Ivoire, I spoke to the Honorable Minister who assured me that they were building 7 or 6 new stadiums for AFCON, and they would dedicate some for the development of rugby. I met the extraordinary Minister of Sport and Education in Morocco, who has a grassroots program which is extraordinary for all sports, and who's also dedicating infrastructure to rugby. So in the countries where you have enlightened leadership, and you have ministers of sports who get it, they have a program that they are saying, we will dedicate. Now that we see the kind of leadership that is coming into Rugby Africa, we are also prepared to work with you in terms of putting up infrastructure in some countries to start picking up some of the costs. After all, they're wearing the national jersey. It's not a private entity. So it is only natural that government should get in and invest. And don't forget that the principles of what rugby stands for has got principles where you talk about respect, loyalty, participation, all the different things that you need your youth to buy into to keep them on the straight and narrow as they grow up and they move through. So some countries get it, and more countries are getting it. But obviously, there's a long way to go before you get the whole continent perhaps adopting this approach.
So Herbert, what should Africans expect from your leadership?
Well, I think they will see a leadership that understands that sport is big business. They'll see a leadership that is now engaging its friends and other unions of a higher rank, if I can put it like that, looking at them eyeball to eyeball. We're not begging. We're not going in there and saying that we are minimalist. We're getting in there and we're demanding respect from the top. I had the privilege of meeting a new president in France for your own grill last 2-3 days ago, and it was a great meeting. And he recognized that they needed to invest more. There is a legacy that says they do need to invest more. And we started looking at different ways in which it is that investment could take place. Maybe not directly, maybe through the French government, maybe through development agencies, maybe through us approaching their existing sponsors with them to see whether they are prepared to get involved in helping Africa. So we've had that kind of a dialogue. The week before, I was in London at a strategic development meeting with the big bosses from World Rugby, and I'm saying the same thing. If gender is one of your pillars, for example, women, obviously, then it is that there's no point in saying, this is what you want to develop further, and then give us the same amount you were giving me in 2019. It makes no sense. If we're going to work together, because as soon as coming to office, one of the first things that I did was to establish a constitutional review. So we're going through that right now to create and make Rugby Africa a far more professional outfit, that is now adapted to now deal with the challenges of modern sports globally. So that's in place. And then it is that we've gone ahead to establish specific workable committees. I'm not one for committees for the sake of committees. So now it is that I've got board members from Rugby Africa. I've appointed them and scheduled them to committees and asked them to establish their own terms of reference and their own KPIs. There's no point in being a director and just being on a board. In 6 months' time, every 6 months, let's evaluate whether the KPIs of the various committees, the rugby committee, the communication committee, the welfare committee, the player welfare committee, the judicial committee, the governance committee, have they actually achieved what it is they set to achieve, or are we dealing with the wrong people on the committees? We must start working. There's no point in just talking for the sake of it. We need people who represent the people so that at the end of the day, people can then sit down and judge and say, in your tenure, you resolve governance problems in Uganda, in Morocco, in Ghana, wherever there may be governance problems. You were able to raise money in this format. You had these challenges. You brought in different competition profiles and structures in order to get further forward. You have better representation now on World Rugby, and so on and so forth, so that by the time we leave, whoever takes over is actually handling a much better ship.
Herbert, before we go, what would be your message to those who will be listening to you around the world?
The message is really quite simple. We crave greater equity for one simple reason. And it is not because of the legacies, but because the greatest sportsmen in the world emanate from Africa. The greatest. If today you look at UFC, you hear of Francis Ngannou and Usman and others. If you talk about NBA, look at the number of Africans who originate from there. If you look at football, look at the French national team. If you look at rugby, look at the French, look at the English, look at the other teams. Look at the fact that South Africa are the world champions today. Because there is an infrastructure, there's an investment, there's a school system, there's a grassroots program that is invested in them to make it work. And when I was in France, I heard that there were 1,200 Africans playing in the top leagues and in the leagues in France alone. So there's no disputing when we look at global sprinters and the women and the men, when we look at long distance runners from Eastern Africa. So you have a situation whereby in a continent of 1.3 billion people, we've got greater greatness in our athletes, more than you have in other parts of the world with similar populations, except for that we don't have the investment. And what I say to the rest of the world is this: believe in us because we believe in ourselves. And if it's about money, just imagine if you invest in a continent of 1.3 billion people, of which I'm being told that by 2050 we might be 2.5 billion, of which 43% of the world's youthful population will be from Africa. The working population, the population that is spending money, the population that is going online. Don't just walk past Africa. Understand that this is the continent of the future. And sports is the way that unifies people, develops people, and entertains people. So I'm really hoping that the rest of the world, big money, small money, people who sit behind a box, people who are wondering where they can see the next superstar in the world, to recognize that that all emanates from Africa.
Thank you very much, Herbert Mensah, for speaking with the Voice of America News.
Thank you so much.